The most important message on climate action is that I would say one of urgency. We have a very narrow window of opportunity, to prevent the worst impacts of climate change. So climate action is not something that can be delayed, of course, the next 10 years or 20 or 30 years. We must take urgent and ambitious action now. So my message is one of urgency. That report should serve as a wake-up call. It should serve as a wake-up call that if we don't take the actions that are needed now to significantly reduce emissions, we will be in significant trouble. The world is on a catastrophic pathway as it relates to climate change. But that report also provides us with some degree of hope. It tells us if over the course of the next decade, we're able to significantly reduce emissions to approximately half of the levels that they're currently at over the course of the next decade, it puts us on a pathway to prevent the worst impacts of climate change. So while it had some really dire and frightening findings, it also tells us that there's still an opportunity, a very narrow window of opportunity for us to reverse course and prevent the worst impacts of climate change. And the good thing is that we have the financial and tools and we have the technologies to do this. We have to be very hopeful. The reality is that the cost of renewable energy has declined significantly over the course of the last decade. In the last decade, the share of renewable energy, clean renewable energy, has increased threefold. If we are to be on a 1.5 degree pathway, we also need over the course of the next decade to increase primarily wind and solar by 3 times yet again over this decade. And renewable energy is all about energy security as well, right? Rather than relying on volatile energy supplies from abroad, countries really need to have a very strong focus on solar and wind. In many instances are the cheapest form of energy in most countries. And these are the types of investments that countries should be making in order to meet their growing energy demands. Adaptation is essentially about saving and protecting lives and livelihoods from climate impact and supporting people to build resilience to increasingly more frequent and intense climate change impact. So it's about essentially saving lives and livelihoods. That's what adaptation is about. So unpacking it a bit, countries face and people face different types of impacts. If you're in a small island developing state, for example, you face sea level rise, you have increasingly more frequent and devastating hurricanes and storms. If you're living in the northwest of the United States, you're facing droughts and you're facing wildfires. And measures to adapt and build resilience seek to protect people from these known climate impacts. So in the case of a small island developing state, many have resorted to building coastal protection. They have pretty extensive seawalls or coastal protection systems. It also means ensuring that your physical infrastructure is able to withstand stronger hurricanes, storms, etc. If you're a country that's faced by increasing drought as a result of climate change, investing in early warning systems, it's preparing farmers and local communities ahead of a potential drought. It's ensuring that you have sufficient reservoirs and reserves of water, etc. So it is different things, but essentially it's about protecting lives. It is about building the resilience of people and communities and businesses to withstand the worsening impacts of climate change. absolutely critical that the world prioritizes climate adaptation now. And the reason is that these impacts are getting worse and they're more severe, and they're getting more severe, and they're already costing lives and also causing major economic disruption across the world, especially in poor and in vulnerable countries. Failure to address adaptation, failure to scale up adaptation and build resilience of peoples and communities means massive loss of lives. It means significant economic disruption. So if we fail to do this, it will cost lives. It will cost lives. The countries and the communities and the people that are most impacted by climate impacts, those that will be most impacted by climate impacts, have contributed the least to this problem. So this is why the Secretary General, this is why he's so passionate about advancing this agenda. Last year alone, 30 million persons were displaced from climate-induced disasters, 3 times more than persons displaced from violence and conflict. We have a significant global threat on our hands, and these investments are crucially are needed now. They're not needed tomorrow. They're needed now so that people can be protected and livelihoods saved. In the Paris Agreement, all countries committed to balance, or developed countries committed to provide public finance that was balanced between mitigation and adaptation. And 6 years later, what we're seeing is that adaptation remains the neglected half of the climate equation. According to the most recent figures from the OECD, adaptation finance accounts for a mere quarter of total climate finance flows. That is not balance. 25% when you're seeing massive impacts all over the world, that is not balance. And this is why the SG, the Secretary General, has been calling on donors and the MDBs to increase the share of their public climate finance to at least 50% of total climate finance flows. There are many reasons why adaptation finance has lagged. The biggest, in my view, is an absence of political will. It's an absence of political will. If countries are absolutely serious at fulfilling this promise made in Paris to balance adaptation finance, it just takes a stroke of a pen. Political will. 3 countries have stepped forward so far in support of the SG's call on 50%. Denmark, the Netherlands, and Sweden. And we hope that others will do it. So you have this problem of the supply of finance, but you also have, on the other hand, issues related to access that vulnerable developing countries face. The red tape that countries have to go through to access climate finance is really unacceptable. So on the access front, this red tape has to be reduced significantly without in any way compromising the quality and the integrity of these projects. There also needs to be a massive effort to support these countries to build internal capacity to better access these funds and effectively execute projects. And there are also challenges that many of these countries face with the eligibility rules governing access to climate finance. Many of the small island developing states and other vulnerable countries are also classified as middle-income countries. And the rules governing access to climate finance are almost identical to the rules governing official development assistance. So therefore, these countries, because in many instances of the per capita income rules being applied, don't have access to grant and concessionary climate finance to invest in many of these resilience building projects and activities. And we see this as short-sighted. In 2019, I, had the unfortunate experience of visiting the Bahamas after Hurricane Dorian. And it was one of the most serene experiences that I've ever had. It seemed as though a bomb had been dropped on an entire island. I've never seen devastation like that in my entire life. You can see, many lives were lost and livelihoods were absolutely decimated and destroyed. I said to one of my colleagues, if this country had access to the resources to strengthen its infrastructure, despite how it's classified by the OECD, would it have made a difference? Would it have saved lives? Would it have saved livelihoods? And these are some of the questions that the international community has to grapple with. It is better to allow these countries to have access to grant and concessionary financing to build and invest in resilience building ahead of these disasters, rather than waiting for them to be decimated and the international community has to respond then with humanitarian assistance. So these are some of the hard choices that governments need to make now, but time is running out. Time is running out, and we have to act. The countries that are on the front lines of the climate crisis, small island developing states, the least developed countries, African countries, and other vulnerable countries, these countries have contributed the absolute least to the climate crisis, the absolute least to the climate crisis. Yet they face disproportionate impacts. Africa is warming much faster than the global average. So if we manage to hold the global increase in average temperature to 1.5, if we're able to meet the Paris target, that's a global average. Africa, the increase in temperature in Africa will be much higher than 1.5. So they will see longer periods of drought and famine. They will see longer periods of extreme of flooding. These frontline countries really need the full support of the international communities. And there's a clear business imperative for making these investments early, but there's also an important moral imperative as well. And quite frankly, after 30 years of multilateral negotiations on climate, after 6 years after the Paris Agreement, where developed countries promise to balance adaptation finance with mitigation finance and are struggling, this is not acceptable. It's really not acceptable. We're hoping that at Glasgow, a clear message is sent that balancing adaptation and mitigation finance is a global priority, and that no effort will be spared. No effort will be spared to fulfill this promise that was made at Paris 6 years ago. I fully agree that we need to enhance planning at the domestic level in countries themselves, in developing countries, to have a much better understanding on the challenges that they will face from a more severe climate. But we need to do that in parallel with making the investments in adaptation and resilience, given the urgency of the challenge. Many developing countries, in their nationally determined contributions, their national climate plans that they submitted ahead of Glasgow, have incorporated this type of work, planning for adaptation. I know that many of the small island developing states, it's a constituency that I'm relatively close to, have nationally owned plans, adaptation and resilience plans, and have incorporated them not only in a UNFCCC document, but also in their medium and long-term development plans. So developing countries, I believe, have, and adaptation cuts across various sectors: energy, transport, agriculture, fisheries. It depends on the national circumstances of countries. So I think developing countries have really taken this seriously and have incorporated adaptation. The challenge remains access to finance. So I think working in parallel to integrate adaptation across the board must be done, but there also needs to be a level playing field at the international level to provide support to these countries. This call by the Secretary General he's been making this very consistent call for leadership by G20 nations. G20 nations account for 80% of global emissions, and we're not going to be on a 1.5 degree pathway. We're not going to keep the 1.5 degree goal of the Paris Agreement within reach without the strong leadership of G20 nations. However, all G20 nations are not alike, right? So you cannot expect the United States, you can't have the same expectations of the United States and India in terms of what they need to do, for example, over the course of the next 10 years. The US is a very wealthy country, it's the largest historical emitter. India, its emissions are growing. However, it's still a developing country with large swaths of poverty. And as it addresses climate change, it also needs to think about development as well, right? What the international community really needs to do as a matter of urgency is for those emerging economies and developing countries who need cheaper alternatives to support their growing energy demands, those cheaper alternatives need to be there. So, for example, in the Asia Pacific region, 94% of the global coal pipeline is in the Asia Pacific region. And the IPCC has made it clear, the single most important step that must be taken to keep the 1.5 degree goal within reach is to rapidly phase out coal. So this region of emerging economies needs to be supported to take a clean energy pathway. And as I said earlier, the technologies are there. Renewable energy in many instances, whether it's wind or solar, is cost competitive with coal and other fossil fuels. So emerging economies, as the Secretary General said, they must make an extra effort. Part of the compact of the Paris Agreement is that they are to be provided with some support if needed, but the expectation remains that there will be leadership from the developed world, recognizing, of course, that we need all to share in this global effort to keep 1.5 degrees alive. I started out as a climate negotiator for Barbados, and then for the Caribbean, and then for this group of 43, 44 countries called the Alliance of Small Island Developing States. And one of the things that I recognized very early was that the role of the small island developing states was really to raise the global alarm that climate change was not only real, but that eventually it will impact all countries. And secondly, really to be the conscience of the convention. So the conscience of the multilateral process. It was daunting for us to put some of the most ambitious proposals on the table, which at the outset were rejected. I remember in 2009, when we put the 1.5 degree goal on the table, the only other group that supported us was the least developed countries. Now, 1.5 is the global goal for ambition. And we recognized back then that even at 1.5, because before then it was 2 degrees, the major economies, the EU, the US, they were all focused on this 2 degree goal. But there was a recognition that for us, 2 degrees would see some of our members disappear from the face of this earth. And I remember in a very difficult meeting that we had back in 2009, we came to the conclusion that it was better to walk away from the table than to accept this 2 degree goal. Things have changed over the years. 1.5 has now become the global aspirational goal, but a lot has not, right? And these countries still face really an uncertain future. So for me, climate is personal, right? Because I have colleagues and friends who still live on these islands. I've sat next to many of them in AOSIS coordination meetings, and we've negotiated together, fought side by side to defend the interests of our people. And we can't let them down. We cannot let them down. So, there have been moments like in Copenhagen when it felt as though we should give up and we had no one supporting us. We have to be constantly reminded about what we're fighting for and who we're fighting for. Quite frankly, this is what continues to inspire and motivate me as well. And it's definitely not about me, but it's about those folks who will never enter one of those meeting rooms, will never participate in a COP, but whose future, whose very future is being determined by the actions of others. So we cannot give up on this fight. It will be daunting, there will be setbacks, but we have to continue to fight for these people. Well, 2 things, if I may. Glasgow really needs to keep 1.5 within reach in a very credible way. We know that the national commitments at the indices will not add up, but it must be credible. It cannot close the window on 1.5. And secondly, on adaptation and resilience, it needs to cease to be the neglected half of the climate equation. And we really need governments, developed countries to step up and support the SG's call for 50%. I've seen repeatedly in this climate process where the vulnerable countries are trotted out as symbols and tokens of climate vulnerable. But words of solidarity or expressions of solidarity are absolutely meaningless. They're absolutely meaningless if they're not backed up with very, very concrete actions to support these countries to adapt and build resilience to climate change. So some 30 years on in the multilateral negotiations on climate change, Glasgow has to be that moment where the world starts to take adaptation and resilience seriously, and that vulnerable countries are not just seen as symbols and tokens that are trotted out to show how why the world needs to take action on climate change, but that their concerns are finally addressed in a meaningful and tangible and concrete way. The only thing that I would add is that we need to continue to find ways to involve young people in the discussions and decisions that are made on climate change. I hear their frustration. They are right. It has taken us too long to act, and now the burden falls on their shoulders. They will be the ones who will be living in a 1.5, 2 degrees or 2.7, 3 degree world. And they should have a seat at the table. They need to have a seat at the table. So I am hoping that at Glasgow and post Glasgow, that the voices of young people are heard, but more than that, that we find ways of ensuring that they have a seat at the table when these important decisions are being taken on their future.